The Allies' immediate objective was the clearing out of all Nazi troops west of the Rhine. This difficult assignment was to fall to 3 army groups, the 21st in the north, the 6th Army Group in the south, and in the center, the 12th Army Group, composed of the U.S. 1st Army and General Patton's 3rd Army, under the overall command of General Bradley. On the Eastern European front, the Russians began a drive of massive dimensions along the entire battle line on January 12, 1945. The offensive was spearheaded by 4 Russian army groups. Commanding one was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who was already becoming a hero of epic proportions to the Russian people. The Russian generals counted heavily on the success of one crushing blow. The Russian offensive staggered the Nazis. In 60 days, the drive by some 300 infantry divisions and 25 tank corps was to push the enemy back across Poland, East Prussia, and across Germany to the Oder River, a distance of roughly 300 miles. In the west, the major Allied drive was also getting started.
As soon as the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies had joined forces at Voorhis on January 16th, Montgomery returned to specific preparation for the advance. Montgomery and I agreed on the proper timing for his initial attack. Originally, we had wanted to make a simultaneous assault by the Canadians and Americans, both of whom could be ready by February 10th. However, neither Montgomery nor I felt it wise to wait. He proposed, and I approved, that the Canadian attack should begin as quickly as possible, even if a period of 2 weeks or more had to intervene before the American Army could join in the operation. The Canadian Army jumped off February 8th. It made satisfactory initial gains, but the troops quickly found themselves involved in a quagmire of flooded and muddy ground. Progress was slow.
According to the plan, the keynote of the operation was to be speed. But the weather conditions could hardly have been more unfavorable for a rapid advance. Allied hopes for a quick breakthrough were killed, and the fighting developed into a bitter slugging match in which the enemy had to be pushed back yard by yard. When the Canadians launched their attack, the enemy was slow to respond. But the attackers' difficulty in moving fast over the waterlogged terrain gave the Nazis a chance to consolidate their defenses. Soon, every offensive move by the Canadians was met by stiff resistance. Every square mile of territory was fought for savagely.
General Marshall suggested that I send my chief of staff to Malta to participate in a conference that was to take place there between the President, the Prime Minister, and their respective staffs before they went on to Yalta.
The combined chiefs of staff endorsed General Eisenhower's plan, questioned by the British command, for cleaning out the area west of the Rhine by a series of crushing blows.
I well knew that with General Marshall backing me, there would be no danger of interference.
Playing a key part in the Allied offensive to the banks of the Rhine were British and American fighter pilots who worked in close support of the Allied ground forces. Veterans of many sorties against the enemy, they were thoroughly accomplished in dealing with Nazi targets.
Groups of fighters could now be located at forward fields near the Rhine, and in spite of their comparatively short range, could operate over almost any Nazi target. As the effects of the air offensive accumulated, there developed a continuous crisis in German transportation and in all phases of her war effort. The effect was felt also by the Luftwaffe. It had a definite influence upon the ground battles. By this time also, the air had achieved remarkable success in depleting the German oil reserves. By early 1945, the effects of our air offensive against the German economy were becoming catastrophic.
After the Canadians launched their drive in the north, General Simpson's U.S. 9th Army and elements of the 1st Army joined the attack.
Preceded by a violent bombardment, the 9th got off as scheduled.
The GIs could do little but wait until the floodwaters of the Ruhr River receded sufficiently for a crossing to be attempted. The opening of the Ruhr River dams by the Nazis had flooded the Ruhr Valley and caused the level of the river itself to rise about 4 feet. For 2 weeks, the flood waters poured down the Ruhr Valley and held up the advance of the U.S. 9th Army. But by February 23rd, the flood had subsided somewhat, and the 9th Army's drive was launched in earnest.
Initially, the troops encountered great difficulties, particularly because of hostile artillery fire upon their floating bridges.
Once across the Ruhr, the advancing GIs had to fight their way through the German city of Jülich. Jülich had been heavily bombed and shelled by the Allies before 9th Army troops entered the city, which they captured on February 24th, the day after they had crossed the Ruhr. The rubble resulting from the Allied air and artillery bombardment slowed the passage of Allied vehicles and equipment through the city en route to the front.
In spite of delays, Simpson's forces made fine progress. In less than a week, the 9th Army captured Mönchengladbach. I entered the city with General Simpson shortly after its capture. This was the largest German city we had captured in the war up to this time. The whole area was rapidly cleared of the enemy. Everything went like clockwork. The 7th Corps on Simpson's right first overcame heavy opposition, then continued a spectacular advance, and on March 5th was on the outskirts of Cologne. We had calculated that this city would be stubbornly defended. But by the afternoon of the 7th of March, General Collins had taken over the city. The hastily trained and astonished defending troops were by no means the equal of those we had met earlier in the campaign.
Completely won in less than 2 days' time. The celebrated cathedral was one of the few buildings still standing after the heavy Allied bombings.
While Collins' 7th Corps was making these great advances, Hodges launched the 3rd and 5th Corps southeastward toward the Rhine. The 3rd Corps reached the river at Remagen on March 7th. Here it encountered one of those bright opportunities of war which produce incalculable effect on future operations. The assaulting Americans found the Ludendorff Bridge over the Rhine still standing at Remagen. When Bradley reported that we had a permanent bridge across the Rhine, I could scarcely believe my ears. I fairly shouted into the telephone, "How much have you got in that vicinity that you can throw across the river?" That was one of my happy moments of the war. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced.
American engineers quickly repaired the damage inflicted on the Ludendorff Bridge by the Germans.
At the same time, we established floating treadway bridges, which were easy to transport, quickly installed, and capable of sustaining heavy military loads.
The first treadway bridge across the Rhine, a 330-yard span, was completed in 10 hours and 11 minutes, and the first load was on its way across the river. Other treadways were constructed, and after 5 days, the Ludendorff structure was no longer needed. The Remagen bridgehead across the Rhine was quickly consolidated.
The German effort against the Ludendorff Bridge finally began to weaken it seriously. And on March 17th, the center span fell into the river. It carried with it a number of our fine engineers, some of whom we were unable to rescue from the icy waters.
North of Remagen, Montgomery prepared for a forced crossing.
The Rhine was a formidable military obstacle, particularly so in its northern stretches. Study of conditions indicated the great desirability of naval participation in the attack. We needed vessels of sufficient size to transport tanks with the leading assault waves, and so the Navy began the transfer to the front of landing boats. These small ships, some of them 45 feet in length and 14 feet wide, were successfully transported overland for participation in the attack. The assault on the night of March 23rd was preceded by a violent bombardment. Our preparations for the crossing had been so deliberately and thoroughly made that the enemy knew what was coming. We anticipated strong resistance, since we would achieve surprise only by the timing and strength of the assault. On the front of the two American divisions making the attack, the 30th and 79th, 2,000 guns of all types participated.
To assist the troops of Montgomery's 21st Army Group, who were to make the assault, a heavy smoke screen was laid down over the area where the crossing was to be made. This assault across the Rhine constituted the major Allied effort in the North in this phase of the battle for Germany. To General Eisenhower, the crossing of the Rhine was one of the most important steps in the hastening of the Nazis' final defeat.
We received a series of encouraging reports. Everywhere, the landings appeared completely successful. The two American divisions making the assault on the 9th Army front suffered a total of only 31 casualties during the actual crossing. We were encouraged to believe that we could very quickly achieve such an eastward advance that the communications leading into the Ruhr would be cut.
The airborne units were scheduled to make their drop on the far side of the Rhine at 10 o'clock on the morning following the assault in small boats. The airborne troops were transported to the assault area in a total of 1,572 planes and 1,326 gliders. The planes were heavily loaded for the trip. The takeoff was a breathtaking operation.
In this operation, the two airborne divisions were to drop close to the front lines, merely far enough back so that they would not be within the zone of our own artillery fire. From those positions, they were to wreck the enemy's artillery organization and participate directly in the tactical battle.
airborne units arrived over the area of Wesel on schedule, and the paratroopers readied themselves for the jump. Preparations were also made for cutting the tow lines and setting the gliders adrift. On the whole, the landings went off smoothly. Only a few Allied planes were shot down.
Operation Varsity, the name given to the airborne phase of this attack, was the most successful airborne operation we carried out during the war.
Meanwhile, the ground forces of Montgomery's 21st Army Group crossed the Rhine in increasing numbers. The preparatory artillery fire and bombing had proved most effective, and a firm foothold was established on the east bank of the river. The town of Wesel was rapidly cleared. The enemy's resistance had been confused and disorganized, and the defending force was quickly overwhelmed.